This Week with Bob Mueller on News 2.
This week.
Well, I think those groups that are advising him are wrong. I think those groups are soft on crime.
Speaker of the Tennessee House, Cameron Sexton's Truth in Sentencing bill is now law, but without Governor Bill Lee's signature.
I think it's a great investment. I mean, we love the Titans. We love that they're doing well.
Speaker Sexton also supports $500 million in state funds to help with construction of a new Titan stadium.
Every corner has music, 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 music.
Despite COVID shutdowns, now inflation's high prices, Tennessee is poised for a record tourism year. More in our This Week cover story.
I know the families all across America are hurting because of inflation.
President Biden makes combating inflation his #1 priority. Hello again and welcome to another edition of This Week. The entertainment industry took a major hit the past 2 years due to COVID-19 and now inflation. And yet, there is great news for Tennessee's entertainment industry. More in our This Week cover story. But first, President Biden targets taming inflation as his #1 goal.
Good evening. Americans have seen the change in prices at gas stations and at stores, and the president says he has a plan.
I know the families all across America are hurting because of inflation.
President Joe Biden promised inflation is a top priority for his administration.
Some of the roots of the inflation are outside of our control, to state the obvious. But there are things we can do and we can address.
National Economic Council Director Brian Deese noted different steps President Biden has taken to combat inflation, like lower gas prices, a proposal to raise taxes on billionaires, and allow Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices.
And also bring down the federal deficit, which actually reduces price pressures in the economy.
Deese says the president urges Republicans to work with Democrats to pass legislation that can help support domestic production of things like semiconductors.
There's every reason why Congress could work in a bipartisan way and get that to the president's desk.
But Republicans like Wyoming Senator John Barrasso claim the president is at fault for inflation.
The Biden administration inflation has become a breaking point for millions of Americans.
Barrasso believes the president needs to accept responsibility for painful prices.
Pointed his finger at everybody else other than himself, and the American people are sick and tired of it.
There is no clear timeline for how long inflation will continue, but the administration says it's working as fast as possible. Reporting in Washington, I'm Basil John.
Now to our This Week's cover story. Despite 2 years of COVID shutdowns, now rising prices for gasoline, food, and housing, Tennessee is ready to rebound. News 2's Chelsea Bimeford tells us tourism leaders predict Tennessee will see a record number of tourists and dollars spent in our state in 2022.
Lights of Lower Broadway.
Every corner has music, 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 music.
To the wonders of East Tennessee.
Gatlinburg tomorrow.
What are you going to do there?
The zip lining and just see the waterfalls in the Great Smoky Mountains.
The volunteer state has a lot to offer.
Great food, great friendly people, so much to do. I'm here for 4 days and I'm afraid it's not enough.
People come from all over the world.
We're from Northern California, Oakley.
We're from a suburb of Philadelphia.
I'm from Hamburg, Germany.
But amidst a global pandemic, rising gas prices, and inflation, what will tourism in Tennessee look like this summer?
The pent-up demand for travel is real.
Brian Wagner, the Assistant Commissioner of Marketing with the Tennessee Department of Tourist Development, says Tennessee tourism is on track for another big year.
We expect a lot of visitors this summer across the state.
In 2021, Wagner says tourism tax collections were up 9.7% despite tight COVID restrictions, likely attributable to the state's numerous outdoor attractions like the Great Smoky Mountains, 56 state parks, and Dollywood.
Tennessee is geographically blessed, and it's about a day's drive from 75% of the population in the United States. So what we're seeing is people are still getting in the car and going, but fortunately, Tennessee might be a shorter trip than, say, going to a national park out west.
And with conventions, business travel, and international travel all coming back into play as COVID restrictions decline, Wagner says the Tennessee Department of Tourist Development predicts a record number of visitors this summer.
We think tourism in Tennessee will be resilient even with high gas prices and inflation. Really, you name it, you can find it in Tennessee.
Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Welcome back to This Week. I'm pleased to be joined by the Speaker of the Tennessee House, the Honorable Cameron Sexton. Nice to see you as always, sir.
Good to see you.
I know you've been busy. You just concluded this legislative session. We'll get into specifics, but your overview of this session.
It was a very productive session. I think the budget went very well. I think we passed some key pieces of legislation that will help Tennessee long term. So I think it was a very good session.
One other issue before we get into the legislative issues, your view on what Governor Lee did last week in regards to halting executions for the year while an independent review of lethal injection protocols takes place.
Yeah, I mean, that's his decision. I don't have all the facts. I don't know everything involved in there. I mean, we do have another means of electrocution as it. So whether or not it's just a brief stop and maybe he moves that route, I don't know. But, I mean, he has to make the decision that he thinks is best.
Any concerns? You probably know more than I do, but he's been vague about what really happened that night that caused the halting of that execution and the need for this independent review. Should we find out more about what really took place that night?
I think they will as they continue to look into it, investigate it. You know, he hired someone to come in or have someone coming in. And so one of the things you do want to make sure in this instance is you don't want to give out more information than you know that's factual. And so you're trying to balance the two, and I think that's what they're trying to do.
And safety, obviously, for everybody's concerned, and the state is responsible, so they want to do this correctly.
Well, and two, if there's pending litigation, potentially, if you say too much and something that's not accurate, it can be used against you, so you want to make sure that you're very factual when you talk about it.
One of your key pieces of legislation that did pass and is now law is the truth in sentencing law. It's very tough on criminals here in Tennessee, especially those convicted of very violent offenses. They must serve 100% of their time, and you say this is important not only to punish the offender, but to honor the victims of these crimes.
That's right. We talked to a lot of victims' families, and the question is, how many crimes could have been stopped if that person who had a violent crime prior to that? Most violent criminals don't just start that way. They build up. So if you're tougher on the front end and they had to serve those sentences, how many people will still be alive today? Our prisons are made up of 65% of nonviolent offenders, 35% violent. So those violent offenders, those crimes that are so heinous and so bad, they should serve 100%. We do have rehabilitation programming mixed in with that for them so that when they do get out, maybe they can return back to life and have some semblance of normalcy. But let's focus on that 65% too and offer them things. We want our prisons to be filled with violent criminals, not the majority nonviolent.
Governor Lee decided to let this become law without his signature. One, did that surprise you at all? And he favors more of a reentry program, which you said this partially does have, and says that widespread evidence suggests this policy will result in more victims, higher recidivism, increased crime, and prison overcrowding, all of it with an increased cost to taxpayers. You responded. You stand with the victims. Is the governor wrong?
Well, I think those groups that are advising him are wrong. I think those groups are soft on crime, and a lot of those groups are making money off our prison system by offering those rehabilitation programs. What I will say is Tennesseans want us to be tough on crime. They want people who commit violent crimes to serve the sentence. The worst thing you can do is tell a family they're going to get 10 years and you see them on the street in 3 years or less, which is happening right now. And so common sense tells you if the guys are locked up longer, there's less crime. I don't need $1 million study to tell me that the longer they serve, the less crime there will be. And they argue about the cost to taxpayers. But what's the cost to that family? What's the cost to society for crimes to keep happening and those loved ones losing their loved ones? What's the value of their life? And so one of the jobs we have as elected officials is to protect our public, protect Tennesseans. And if that means we need to be tough on violent criminals, I don't think people disagree with that approach.
You talked about the cost, and I'm sure that was part of your discussion. By not allowing certain groups of felons any possibility of reducing their sentence could mean housing more prisoners longer, likely a need for more prison space. Obviously, the legislature debated this and decided that this is worth the outcome of keeping Tennesseans safe, even if it means building more prisons, costing more per inmate to house these people.
I mean, are Tennesseans really going to say that violent criminals shouldn't be in prison? Should we not have prisons filled with violent criminals? If we need more prisons, why can't we build more prisons? Is public safety, at what level does taxpayer costs come with protecting society? And so I value society. I value making sure violent criminals are locked away. Let's talk about the 65% who are currently in there. They say the prison population's increased and it's overcrowding. 65% of the people in there are nonviolent offenders. Let's put the programs in place and let's really start trying to help them where the nonviolent offenders don't come back. Let's talk about K through 12 education and talk about how we can put things in K through 12 to stop the pipeline of criminals who are coming out. Because we know if someone doesn't graduate high school, we know how likely they are to be in poverty and how likely they are going to be in jail. Criminal justice reform does not start in the jail. It starts in K through 12 education, juvenile intervention programs as they're trying to get there. We got to stop them before they become adult offenders, not after they're adult offenders.
And part of this legislation does do what you're talking about. You're not just tough on crime, you're tough on the very violent crime, but part of this legislation gives those convicted of lesser offenses, and there's quite a list, but these felons, they do get the chance to earn programming, drug and mental health treatment education, job training credits to reduce their sentence from 100% to 85%. So for these, there is incentive for good behavior and to advance while they're in the prison system.
Yes, and so it's a two-pronged approach. Like I have a hard time saying that if a prisoner did not shank or spit on a guard today, that they get time off their sentence for good credit. We should expect good behavior in prison.
They have to earn this, is what you're saying.
It should be an expectation. In order to reduce your sentence from 100% to 85%, the only thing you can do is rehabilitation programs, things that will help you when you leave, whether that's anger management, alcohol addiction, mental health issues. Things that will help you when you get out should reduce your sentence, not because you didn't spit on the guard that day.
This law builds on legislation you passed last year, I think, that covers like 31 different offenses regarding assaults on women, that these felons would also have to be required to serve 100%. There's been times in our past, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when Tennessee and other states have gotten tough on crime. 3 strikes, you're out. Why do you think it'll work better this time? It didn't work then. You fill up the prisons. There still is crime. Why do you think these messages will be sent to people to prevent them from committing these crimes?
Well, look, I think this is the perfect hybrid approach. You have all these soft on crime groups that says you need to have rehabilitation in there. So we have rehabilitation in there, but we also have longer sentences. In 2020, the U.S. Sentencing Commission put forth a panel study that said if you're in prison 5 years or longer, you're 30% less likely to reoffend and have a recidivism. If you're there for 10 years or longer, you're 45% less likely to have recidivism, meaning less crime. So we know what longer sentences mean. You add on the rehabilitation, those numbers will go lower. I'm not the kind that says to you, if you had a family member that committed a crime, to say they should get out in 30%. If I was disciplining my kid, how the prison system works is I tell my child, you're grounded for 4 weeks. But you know what? In Tennessee, you only have to do 30%. So you only have to do 1.2 weeks. But then if you make up your bed and you eat all your dinner, I'm going to give you another 25% reduction and you're gone in 4 days. What does your child do to you as a parent knowing that you gave them 4 and they walked out the door after 4 days?
Our conversation with House Speaker Cameron Sexton continues on this and other issues. When This Week continues, stay with us. Welcome back to my conversation with House Speaker Cameron Sexton. We're talking now about truth in sentencing, and one of the aspects you talked about, you're highlighting, is concentrating on victims. And one of the things that this does, this means for many people, you say that these mandatory sentence laws supports victims and families by allowing them to no longer have to relive these horrific events that were committed against their family, and they're not having to go to a parole hearing year after year after year. They know that these people are going to be serving this time.
I can't tell you how many victims I've talked to, their families, who says someone got 10 years, they're up for parole in 3, and we have to go back every year, relive the details, fight to keep that person in jail for the next 7 years, and they're not going to win all 7 years. And they go, how do we get on with our lives? How do we overcome this if we have to keep living it? So just for the victims and their families on these violent crimes, not non-violent, violent crimes, let the sentence be the sentence. I'm tired of people saying, you know what, I'd rather be tried in state court than the federal court because the federal system's tough. Let's make ours tougher and say, you know what, federal government's soft on crime. Tennessee's hard on crime.
Not every crime is a serious violent crime. Is there a place in this, criminal justice reform is a big issue. Is there a place down the road to look at make sure that there is consistency in sentencing, to look at people who have been sentenced to longer terms for maybe relatively minor offenses so that the equity does in fact become across the board?
Well, I think so, and I think that's what we try to do with violent crimes. You know, I mean, there's instances when we talk to attorney generals in the state where someone killed somebody with their car. Mm-hmm. And they had drugs in their car. They got more time for the drugs than they did for killing the person. To your point, that's backwards, right? And so, yes, we need to rewrite it. I think this helps us on the violent offenders. If we need to go back for nonviolent, look at that, so be it. But really, when we talk about criminal justice reform, we have to talk about in the aspect of juvenile crime in K through 12 education. That's how we stop crime in the future. We can't stop it once they're in prison. We need to do things prior.
A couple other issues. You had a busy legislative session. There was a law passed this year that does make it a felony or a misdemeanor in some cases for the homeless folks to camp on public property. Governor Lee did not sign this bill. Obviously, homelessness is growing. It's becoming an increasing issue. It needs to be under control. But does this punishing folks who are just having a very tough time address the root problem? Does it solve the homeless issue?
Well, I don't know if it solves the homeless issue. We've talked to the mayors about how to do affordable housing. What things do we need to do to help that? Rising cost is causing some problems. What this bill really does is it gives the law enforcement the tools, it's permissive, to help move those camps that may be in a dangerous situation. They're off to the interstates, they may be in the flood area. I think you saw that in Nashville not too long ago. It gives them the ability to help move those people out. It doesn't mean they have to charge them for that. It gives them the ability to help move them to somewhere else to where maybe they're not have an issue with where they're camping.
It's a tough issue. What can the legislature do? I mean, we don't want to become San Francisco. They're having massive homeless problems, but it is growing here in the bigger cities. Knoxville's got a big problem downtown. Other than affordable housing and trying to get these folks educated and mental health issues too, what can the legislature do to help?
Right,
these
and that's where I was going to go. I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of the homeless people, there's mental health issues, there's drug addictions. This year we passed a bill where if you do a crime, I mean, there's nonviolent criminals who have an addiction and they're doing petty theft and they end up going in jail. This year we passed to go along with our drug courts, mental health courts and juvenile mental health courts, to allow the courts to take that into account, and maybe instead of sending them to prison, they send them to get help. So a lot of the issue of people who are homeless, some of it's they're homeless and they're in hard times, we need to help them get back on their feet, but they also need some type of services. So we need to do more about mental health and more about addiction and helping those people overcome whatever issues they have.
I wanted you to expand on that because I think the mental health courts that you established this year are real unique and will really help this problem in a statewide. So when prosecutors are looking at issues, if folks have issues regarding mental health, in need of mental treatment, there's a place that they can now go to at least have it adjudicated.
That's right. And so we worked with, one thing I will say about Davidson County and Nashville is they were leading in this effort decades ago. And so we've talked to those judges and they helped us craft this legislation. Because when someone comes to court and we know they have a mental health and addiction problem, jail is usually not the best place to treat that. So if they're willing to get treatment, maybe you don't send them to jail or to prison, you put them in a treatment facility or a place to help them overcome that to get them back up on their feet.
After 30 years, you have changed the way public schools are funded in Tennessee. It's unique, it's different. We're going to see if it works. It focuses on children, money attributed or allocated to children as opposed to school districts. In some districts like Nashville, total money will be actually less in Nashville and Davidson County. They're not happy about that. You feel, though, that allocating the money to the student will actually improve the education system.
It will. I mean, Nashville's getting more than what they were getting before. It's a game of less or not.
It's how you look at it.
We're not going to get into that aspect of it. But realistically, what it does is every student has unique needs and unique abilities and maybe have different expenditures. Not every kid in school has $7,000 worth of needs that they have, but that's the old formula.
Right.
The other problem is the old formula was doing it as in the 80s when I was in school, and today's classroom is much, much different. And so we're recognizing that if you're in a high poverty area or if you have these types of disabilities, you need additional money in that school system to help overcome that. Reading and literacy is in there as well. CTE programs, vocational's in there. So it's more of a way to identify how to help districts with kids so you don't treat them all the same. You treat them based on what needs that they have.
There is concern that some of these kids who will have the option to take themselves to a different school, to change schools, will take the money with them, and inner city schools may suffer because of that.
Well, I mean, you have competition in business, you have competition in everything, and if you're providing a product that's really good, those people aren't going to leave. Those parents aren't going to have their child to leave. So the best way to make sure that the students stay within your school system is provide value to the parents.
The state has committed and approved $500 million for the Titans' new stadium. Governor Lee has talked about this as a way for the state. It will be a money-making aspect. The taxpayers' funds will come back. Do you support this? Do you think that this is a good investment for the state tax dollar, that there will be return on this?
I think it's a great investment. I mean, we love the Titans. We love that they're doing well. we know that they're a huge economic part of Nashville and Tennessee and what they provide us and the marketing that we get off of it. I'm not sure you can take into account everything that they do for us. It's just not monetary. There's a lot of outside Tennessee that comes into play when you have somebody like the Tennessee Titans here. So it's much more than just Nashville, as some people are saying. But it will return, because if we get one Super Bowl, if we get this on a national scale, what does that do? We saw what the TV show did for Tennessee, the show called Nashville, and what that brought to Nashville. And so we're a sales tax-based state. So why not take other people's money? And so if people want to come here and go to the Titans game, if people want to do a big conference here, if people want to do the Super Bowl here or WrestleMania, WWE, why shouldn't we take other people's money? I'm for that.
House Speaker Cameron Sexton, always appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. That will do it for another edition of This Week. I do want to thank my guest, House Speaker Cameron Sexton. We hope to see you back here next weekend for another edition of This Week. Between now and then, you have a great week.